And the conversations that we've been having are, for us in the RCMC, also a set of experiments, and we want to see what other tools we can pull together to think about the role of our, as I said, collection in the present, how we exhibit them, what we do with them, what does the museum itself represent in the present. You know, many people ask, what do you do with a 19th century collection in the 21st century?
I think that there is a fundamental way in which the slave past cannot be thought of as being behind us, but is in a real way before us. But crucial to this redescription is that what once upon a time were thought of as social and economic subjugations and oppressions or even exploitations to be overcome, or more militantly, to be overthrown, are now reconceived as historical wrongs to be rectified or historical injuries to be redressed. And part of what I want to suggest is that the temporality of redress and the temporality of overcoming are significantly different in significant ways. This distinction between overcoming and redressing is the province of reparatory justice. It seems to me very important to recognize that, therefore, that the idiom and the model of reparatory justice are juridical and moral psychological rather than economic, social, political. That reparatory justice aims at repair, not transformation. That the domain of reparatory justice is rights, not freedom.
I've been interested lately in what sovereignty feels like, that complex of violent regulation and expectant self-determination that leans toward one or the other of these interlocking poles, depending on the time or place. If sovereignty in both these iterations emerges in and through violence, that of biopolitical governmentality or that of Fanon's worlding revolution, it seems also worth asking what repair would feel like. I've said repair here rather than reparation in order to mark a shift in orientation, a shift similar to the one marked by a move from resistance to refusal. Repair, like refusal, is practice-oriented and quotidian. It is non-eventful and deeply historical and relational. Repair, like its nominal counterpart, urges us to interrogate the multiple scales of entanglement that have led us to the fierce urgency of now. But where reparation seeks justice through the naming of names, the exposure of public secrets, and the articulation of chains of causality, repair looks for something else. It demands an active listening, a mutual recognizing and acknowledging of complicity at all levels, behavioral evidence of profound interior transformations that are ongoing.
Such images were eagerly distributed to show the army's progress. Prints were sent to several archives, exhibited in the colonial capital Batavia, and published in a book on the expedition that could be bought in Dutch bookstores. And the text in this book and all the text in the military reports are very explicit and precise about the killings that took place, as were the many articles that had appeared in the Dutch newspapers at the time. But and between 1904 and 2010, this and several other photographs returned dozens of times in Dutch newspapers, television documentaries, and on other prominent places in the Dutch media. But still in 2012, a Dutch national newspaper published a number of photographs on its front page under the header, "First Images of Executions in the Indies." Well, this perpetual rediscovery of the same, this eternal surprise at Dutch guilt, did we do that? Who hid this from us? Has, of course, one big advantage. The Dutch can position themselves as not knowing about their own country's horrible past and, moreover, blame one of the groups I mentioned earlier for withholding this knowledge from them. This is what I call the narrative of Dutch innocence. And in my book, I use Stoler's concept of cultural aphasia to indicate what we can see as the difficulty in the Netherlands to find a language that is appropriate for this past.
And so we've got new forms of museum that are not collections. We have new forms of museum that imagine new forms of personhood. And I'll come back to that right at the end. Because what we've also been dealing with is how do you address the 19th century museum in a post-colony? What do you do with the legacies of racial science and anthropology as you imagine a new nation? And the one thing that has become very clear is that you cannot make a new nation on the basis, on utilizing the anthropology museum.
We were very strong that Native people would be the curators, that the staff itself would not be the curators. And we traveled to these communities. We literally traveled with the exhibition models and went to and had public meetings in the communities. They really were community built. People really feel like these represent their world. These two pieces is a Yupik on your right, and this is Santa Clara Pueblo on your left. And what they did was they constructed their worldview or their cosmology in the exhibition itself. But this is one of the ways that our curator decided he wanted to talk about history. And we agreed with this approach. No one liked this approach. He thought there were three things that pulled Native people together throughout the hemisphere, three common elements: guns, Bibles, and treaties. Now, we were also involved in a series of projects, and I want to tell you about a couple of the repatriations that we got to be involved with. These two women from Haida, or Haida Gwaii, 2 minutes. They went through United States collections, and they found 660 of their ancestors that had been removed from cemeteries and brought them home. It was a 5-year project just to find them, and they also built burial boxes.
I think we should not separate the words indigenous and peoples. I think they belong together. And then we should also not forget that the term indigenous peoples was not coined to categorize peoples. In fact, the UN never went as far as actually producing some type of definition who or what indigenous peoples officially are. It is very clear that the term is used to refer to a problem within the field of human rights. The term comes obviously from a colonial vocabulary, and it is used consciously to denounce the ongoing structures of injustice provoked by colonialism and to refer to peoples who suffer from that situation. A comment on the redress. This is not only about objects. Objects are important. Beings are important. But it is also about everything that goes with it. The memories, the participations, the interpretations, etc., etc., and the non-participation, generally speaking, of indigenous peoples in that whole discourse. There are leading institutions, academia and museums alike, in which the discourse about indigenous cultures and indigenous peoples is in the hand and in the mouth of others, not of the indigenous peoples themselves. And indigenous people then become informants, props, maybe some scapegoats or excuses for what others are doing.
We are the problem, according to this perspective. What is the role of the former colonial powers as Spain and United Kingdom in the case of the Maya peoples? How and in which terms reparations are addressed? How to negotiate the terms on equal and decolonized conditions? What is the meaning of gender in the politics of redress? How to avoid the notion of racism, injustice in the justice framework. And for me, it's important to notice that most of our people barely know about our cultural heritage, either being preserved in our own communities or either in collections around the world. More than 5 centuries of colonization have been succeeding on disconnecting our people from our ancestors and their cultural legacies.
This is our background. We are not academics. We do not have a background in sort of working in museums, etc. We work from an embodied experience of being confronted with the everyday effects of colonial thinking in its many forms. And our own experience as visitors to the Tropenmuseum before getting involved in this project showed us that that museum is absolutely essential in reproducing that colonial thinking. So what was this intervention? What did it look like? It was a series of conversations, at first with us, and then we invited a group of critical people, friends and friends of friends, mostly people of color, mostly between the ages of 20 and 35, and we asked them to come to the museum and tell us what they honestly thought. Many of them were of African descent, yeah, people of different genders and sexualities. We asked them how walking through the museum made them feel, what stood out, most of them, what they hoped to gain from the visit, what kind of expectations they had, and how they think the museum needs to change to stop reproducing violence. I think it's important to know that many of the people that were part of the project ended up having quite a traumatic experience just walking through the museum.
What's important to know about the focus groups that we had was who was in the groups. Because as people mentioned before, like we're having a conversation. In the Netherlands, you don't really have a conversation about colonialism, because if you have it with the wrong people or with a specific kind of group, you get stuck on this very apologetic nature. So we were very adamant about getting people in a room that we can left the conversation at a specific point.
I asked them if there would be any interest for what was then called colonial collections. And they said, yes, we are very much interested because we want to tell the colonial story in the museum, and we can't at this point tell that story enough with the objects we have. So we started to talk about what kind of objects are you interested in. And I start with the oldest colonial objects, which is the furniture of the Dutch Colonial East India Company, mainly made in Jakarta. I think 1 or 2 pieces may have been made in Sri Lanka.
In this escarpment were caves, and these caves were used as necropoles and were full of buried persons with clothes on and their jewelry. Almost everything that was found during these excavations went to the Netherlands, and after the Institute of Bioanthropology closed, the collection came to the Museum Volkenkunde. And we asked the director of the museum in Mali to divide the collection in 2 equal parts. That's what he did, this is not what we did. And one of this collection went back to Mali, and the other one stayed in our museum as a long-term loan.
And so much of what I'm talking about is really deals with questions which were addressed by Linda Tuhiwai-Smith in her seminal book on decolonizing methodologies, arguing that the term research is linked to European imperialism and Western colonialism, and is probably one of the dirtiest words in the indigenous world's vocabulary, and trying to, I guess, undo some of those wrongs and make sure that we don't repeat histories of violence when we're doing research, and making sure that we're actually working along the lines of the Declaration of Indigenous Rights, where we talk about who are the primary guardians, who are the interpreters, who are the people who control the knowledges, etc. So that is kind of the context within which we want to frame this. We also had to talk to a lot of the politicians. This was in the parliament building with some of the heads of parliaments, because the government has a big interest in being involved. And at the same time, the indigenous communities do not want the government to be involved too much.
You know, it was at the end of the Java War, Diponegoro, who was the main leader of the war on the side of the Indonesians, he had to surrender his weapons. His main weapon was the dagger, the kris. And the kris, we guess it must have come to the Netherlands, and it was part of the discussions between the Dutch government and the Indonesian government on the return of cultural objects. And in these in the joint recommendations which they reached in 1975, it was said that you can read, with regard to objects of historical emotional value, such as those belong to Diponegoro, the Dutch government be willing to find a ways for their transfer to Indonesia. But it's still missing, and nobody knows what it is. And maybe it's in a private collection, but in the same recommendations, it says that, you know, non-state owned objects, the Dutch government render assistance within the limits of its competence in establishing the necessary contacts. It never did anything to do so. It's the Washington Principles, it's also the Vilnius Principles, but for instance also the German Museum Association has recently come with new guidelines for dealing with colonial human remains. And one of the articles in the guidelines is that museums and heritage institutions, they should actively look for things, you know, which should not be in their possession and which they should discuss with them. And I have to make up my mind whether it is useful to formulate such general guidelines for dealing with return matters of colonial cultural objects.